Hello and welcome to the last session of week 5. In our final session, we will be looking at how Korean painters and art students were trained in Western style art in the early 20th century. Let's begin. After the abolition of the Royal Bureau of Painting and the introduction of Western style painting to Korea, many pervasive changes took place in the Korean art scene. Korean painters could no longer depend on the government for their livelihood and had to find ways to sustain themselves in the evolving art market. By the end of the 19th century, new media were introduced, offering young and ambitious artists opportunities to learn and train in Western-style painting and photography. Most importantly, such changes of the time redefined the roles and status of professional painters. First, professional painters of the late 19th century faced the challenge of earning a living solely from their art. Professional painters, unlike Yangban literati painters, were of Chungin class, composed of lower-level officials and professionals that took on roles of translators, medical doctors, legal officers, professional artists, and other practical and professional vocations. Throughout the Joseon period, these artists struggled to sustain themselves, as they were rarely paid fairly and consistently outside of the court. Many patrons and clients paid what they deemed appropriate for the artist's services, often compensating them with goods rather than money. Except for exceptionally renowned artists, many ordinary painters faced significant difficulties in achieving a sustainable livelihood. In the 19th century, art became increasingly commodified due to the growth of the commercial market and monetary exchanges, making paintings accessible to the general public. The overall demand for art significantly increased due to the growth of the Chungin class at the end of the Joseon period, which meant that there was a larger population with disposable income to spend on paintings, artwork, and other leisurely pursuits outside of the small Yangban class. This not only gave professional artists more clients, but also elevated artists' own social standing in Joseon society. Slowly but gradually, professional painters became more than technicians who could produce commissioned pieces of paintings to modern artists who created artworks that realized their own artistic pursuits. Art education and training also underwent change from the 20th century. Art education in the Joseon period relied on personal forms of education for the purpose of the preservation and continuation of traditional styles and techniques. In the Joseon period, the most institutionalized source of education of art was the Royal Bureau of Painting, where students would be assessed on their capabilities in traditional types of paintings: bamboos, landscapes, portraits, birds and animals, flowers and plants. In and outside of the court, students or apprentices often formed close and personal relationships with their teachers and thought it virtuous to take on their styles to a certain extent. Even artists of the early 20th century, such as An Jung-sik, followed this custom and taught students in his private studio, Gyeongmokdang. Go Hee-dong, who was a student of An Jung-sik, lamented that the style of teaching in Korea was old-fashioned and it still relied on copying Chinese painting manuals. It was not until the 20th century and the establishment of art schools during the colonial period that art education became institutionalized and diversified to include categories of Western art, modeled after Japanese and French institutions. While more and more artists wished to learn Western-style painting from the 20th century, there was a lack of specialists and resources to train these artists in Korea. The first generation of Western-style painting in Korea had to learn to paint abroad. Traveling outside of Korea was not easy in the early 20th century. Japanese occupation led to greater legal restrictions to international travel, but allowed more students to travel specifically to Japan to learn various arts and sciences. This was a way of controlling the colony and of cultural assimilation, particularly from the 1920s, when colonial authorities realized the ineffectiveness of oppressive governance after the 1919 March 1st movement and opted for cultural appeasement. In the 1910s, many early Korean oil painters were trained in the Tokyo School of Fine Arts. The Tokyo School of Fine Arts was established in 1887 and became a leading institution for educating artists in Western-style painting, reflecting Japan's drive to modernize through a blend of Western and traditional artistic practices. Students at the Tokyo School of Fine Arts who studied Western-style painting, or yoga, were trained rigorously in techniques influenced by their European academic traditions. The curricula typically included the study of drawing, anatomy, perspective, and oil painting, with an emphasis on mastering realism. The training process involved copying classical works, live figure drawing from plaster casts or models, and understanding Western artistic concepts like light, shadow, and composition. Many teachers at the school, such as Kuroda Seiki, were artists who had studied in Europe, particularly in France, bringing back contemporary European styles such as Impressionism and Realism to their students. The Tokyo School of Fine Arts became an essential institution for fostering Western-style painting in Japan, positioning its students as pioneers in Japan's modern art movement. Many Korean students such as Ko Hee-dong and Kim Gwan-ho studied there in the early 20th century, gaining exposure to techniques like oil painting and realism. The school provided a foundation for these artists to incorporate Western artistic methods into Korean art, which significantly influenced the development of modern art in Korea during the colonial period. In particular, Kuroda Seiki emphasized the use of light and naturalistic representation, which profoundly impacted these Korean students. The exposure helped lay the groundwork for the integration of Western aesthetics into Korean art in the early years of the 20th century. Unfortunately, first-generation artists of Western painting faced significant difficulties continuing the practice after they returned to Korea. Ko Hee-dong, for example, almost immediately returned to traditional ink painting after returning to Korea in 1915. He found it difficult to fit into the new art world, where art was openly sold as commodities. He found himself having to prove himself as a professional artist rather than a bureaucrat who painted for leisure. He himself later mentioned that back then, buying paintings was seen as an impropriety that went against Confucian virtues. His worries were especially strong because oil painting was still very much foreign in Korea. He later recalled that when he would walk around Seoul with a sketchbox, people would follow him around because they thought that he was selling taffy and would sneer at the sight of oil paint and remark that it resembled chicken feces. This kind of embarrassment and the lack of fellow Western-style painters in Korea led to his abandonment of oil painting soon after returning to Korea. However, he submitted an oil painting to the first Chosun Art Exhibition in 1922 for the very last time, perhaps reflecting his lingering attachment to his position as Korea's first oil painter, or his desire to be recognized as such in the art market of the 1920s when there was a greater influx of Western-style art than before. Kim Gwan-ho, on the other hand, continued to paint in oil after graduation. As Kim was already a star student at the Tokyo School of Fine Arts, who graduated with top marks, he had considerable confidence in his self-identification as a modern artist. In 1915, he won a silver medal for his painting Figure at the Chosun Industrial Exhibition. In 1916, he achieved special recognition at the 10th Ministry of Education Art Exhibition in Japan for his pioneering and controversial nude painting Sunset. That same year, his first solo exhibition in Pyongyang, showcasing about 50 landscape paintings, set a milestone in Korean art, further establishing his reputation as a Korean oil painter. This was the first solo exhibition of oil paintings in Korea and was well received by the public. However, popular intrigue in the new medium did not correlate to sales, and Kim faced significant financial difficulties and lack of support for his artistic activities, eventually stopping painting for almost 20 years in the late 1920s. Even the most successful painters in Western art struggled to continue to work as professional oil painters in the early colonial period. After the return of the first generation of Western-style painters to Korea, students continued to flock to Japan to train in oil painting. As mentioned before, it was difficult to learn Western-style painting from Korean teachers, as few of them had the expertise. The few that were trained in oil painting found it difficult to continue a career as a professional oil painter in Korea. While only a handful of artists had the opportunity to travel outside of Asia to study painting, the number of Korean art students to Japan greatly increased from the 1920s. This coincided with the colonial government's so-called cultural rule policy, whereby they allowed for greater freedom in the arts and culture as an appeasement policy to contain and control resistance against the colonial regime. The first generation of Western-style artists remained influential figures in the Korean art scene. Despite giving up on oil painting, Ko Hee-dong became a founding member of Sewahyeophae, Korea's first artists' association in 1918. The first and second president of the association were An Jung-sik and Cho Seok-jin. Sewahyeophae became a central organization led by the most prominent Korean artists of the time that allowed artists to socialize, receive training, hold exhibitions, and even sell their artworks. It aimed to enlighten and educate the public, facilitate the growth of the art market in Seoul, foster a modern exhibition culture and artistic community, and support the autonomy of Korean artists under colonial rule. Hyopjeon referred to the association's annual exhibition that began in 1921 and ended in 1936. Around 100 works were exhibited, and the exhibition did not categorize works by genre. As indicated by its name, Calligraphy and Painting Association, most members were engaged in traditional calligraphy and inkwash paintings, and there was a relatively low proportion of oil painters. In its first year in 1921, only 8 oil paintings were exhibited by Na Hae-seok, Ko Hee-dong, and Choi Woo-seok, out of 78 paintings and 30 calligraphy works. While the proportion of oil and watercolor paintings gradually increased after the 1920s, there were no works of sculpture and crafts. Additionally, the association founded a training institution called Seowa Hagwon in 1923 for the next generation of Korean artists. The academy was divided into 3 departments: Eastern Painting, Western Painting, and Calligraphy. Instructors included Lee Do-young and Ko Hee-dong, but there were very few students. Due to financial difficulties, the academy closed just 2 years after its opening in 1925. Nevertheless, it marked the first attempts at modernizing and institutionalizing art education in Korea. With the growth of Sewahyeophae and the significant success of the first Hyopjeon, colonial authorities quickly established their own annual exhibition of fine arts to thwart the growing influence of Sewahyeophae and reclaim control over the Korean art scene. The Chosun Art Exhibition first opened in 1922, 1 year after Hyopjeon. The exhibition was hosted by the Government General and quickly surpassed Hyopjeon in popularity and size. The Chosun Art Exhibition benchmarked government-run annual exhibitions in Japan, modeled after the French Salon. In the formative years of the exhibition, it had categories of Western painting and sculpture, Oriental painting and calligraphy. The Western painting division's jury were entirely Japanese, particularly from the Tokyo School of Fine Arts, who judged artworks based on the tastes of the Japanese, preferring works exhibiting academic and impressionistic styles. Japanese artists were also allowed to submit works if they had resided in Korea for over 6 months. In the beginning, Japanese artists took up most of the submissions for Western-style painting. As Korean Western-style artists grew in number and began to cater to Japanese tastes, many talented Korean Western-style artists such as Lee In-sung, Na Hae-seok went on to win prizes in Western painting throughout the colonial period. The Chosun Art Exhibition became the most important event in the Korean art scene as it provided artists with exposure and prestige. In particular, the Chosun Art Exhibition printed catalogues, which was a significant advantage compared to Hyopjeon. Exhibiting works at the Chosun Art Exhibition became a sort of professional debut for artists, and winning prizes at the exhibition was almost a guarantee of the artist's success in the market. The dominance of the Chosun Art Exhibition eventually led to the dissolution of the Sewahyeophae in 1936. The popularity of Hyopjeon quickly dwindled after the holding of the Chosun Art Exhibition, and almost all members of Sewahyeophae ended up participating in the Chosun Art Exhibition in addition to Hyopjeon. Although the association ultimately failed to continue to achieve the initial goals of preserving Korean autonomy in the arts, it marked an important feat in Korean art history, in which Korean artists initiated the professionalization of artists and took control over their own activities and actively marketed their works. This week, we looked at the introduction of Western style art in Korea. We have covered topics of early exposure to Western paintings, foreign visitors who brought with them new media, artists who traveled to Japan and China to learn Western style art, new types of portraits produced in Western medium, and the emergence of Western style artists in Korea. Next week, let's explore the world of photography and print media. See you soon.